Mark 5:21-34. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and pleaded with him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately, her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." What is the truest thing about you? This week, we focused on Mark 5, one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture, and my patron saint, the bleeding woman. I love her. And we heard this story from Mark's Gospel that is called an interpolation, which is a big word for saying one story that interrupted a story that was already happening. So we hear Jesus accosted by a synagogue leader, Jairus, who said his little daughter is ill. Can you please come and lay hands on her? I know that you can make her well. Jesus sets off on the journey, and in the middle of the journey, with the important dude and the disciples and the crowds all around, a random woman who would have been ritually unclean and who would have not been accepted in the culture, let alone her physical illness, she decides to interrupt Jesus. She grabs his cloak, she's healed, and Jesus stops in the text, and he stops the story. He turns around, he looks her in the face, and he calls her daughter. Now, the attention of the crowd is totally set on Jairus' daughter, and this woman probably hadn't been anybody's daughter or anybody that anyone cared about for a really long time. She'd spent all that she had. No doctors had made her any better, and yet she finds herself ill and trying all that she can to advocate for herself, to find healing and wholeness, and to get this last chance, this glimpse, this healing from a man she's no doubt heard about. Jesus stops the story, and he stops the crowd, and turns to look at her, and he calls her daughter. Now, of course, the story goes on. Jairus' daughter is also healed, but I think this story has a really powerful thing to say about our identity. What we come to understand in this story is that Jairus' daughter and Jairus' people are important, and they are not forgotten. But those who are forgotten are elevated. The way that God sees people in crowds is not simply the way in which we create cultural hierarchies, but the God of the universe takes time to look in the faces of the people who feel left out, who feel forgotten, who feel overlooked, to people who have been written off by everybody else, turns God's attention to them, and God invites us to do the same. And the reason I asked, when is it that you felt like the most yourself? When were you the most you? Is because a lot of times in our world and in our culture, and particularly if you're at the life stage in teen years and young adult years, we have this social and emotional crisis, this identity versus role confusion. How do we figure out who I am and who I might be in the rest of my life? And so in our new series, as we talk about identity, what we're focusing on is, how do we first hear who God says we are? God, who created you, who knows you, who loves you, that God takes time to stop the crowds, to look you in the face, even when you feel forgotten, and to remind you that you are a child of God. You are God's beloved. In fact, the first thing that was ever spoken over humanity We get through the whole creation story, and we get to the very end. And the very end, everything is good. It's good. It's good. It's good. But then God creates humanity in God's image and likeness. And then God calls it very good. Creation, humanity, this beautiful completeness. And so as we begin this series, I want to challenge you this week to spend a little time just thinking, who is it that God says that I am? And some time in silence listening for the echo of God calling you very good.